Hey, Impact Communities, I'm Kate, and I am coming at you with the second week for our Wanderers versus Conquerors series. And this week, we talked about identity. Last week, Josh talked about our story and our history and how it can be our stumbling block or our starting block. But all of this is a moot point if our identity isn't right. Man, we get tripped up on our identity more times than we can count. I know I do, and I'm willing to bet even if you look back at your past week or even the past month, there were times in your life where it was how you viewed yourself and what identity you're walking in that tripped you up. And so that's why it's so important that we tackle this and that we talk about this. Josh he talked about Moses, but he did it through the perspective of Stephen. Stephen was a man in the early church that loved God and ultimately died for his love and allegiance to Jesus, but not before speaking this incredible kind of dissertation to the Pharisees and the people that would end up killing him. And he lays out this timeline about all that the God of Israel has done for his people and through his people. And so he talks about Moses. And so that's how Josh talks and enters into the story of Moses. He talks about Moses. Last week we talked about Moses' birth. This time we talked about Moses and leaving and fleeing from Egypt because he had killed an Egyptian who was going to kill a Hebrew. Moses had to flee. He fled to the wilderness. He ended up living there for 40 years. He got married. He had a few kids. And then he encounters God, and God meets with him in a miraculous encounter of a burning bush. And it's through that moment that God kind of prepared and called out Moses to be a father to these Israelites and taking them out of slavery under Egypt and into the promised land. And so a few points that Josh makes is he wants us to in how to have an identity building moment or even to walk in our identity is we've got to know what our identity is. And that all happens when we recognize the presence of God. Moses recognized when he was in the presence of God with this burning bush and he trembled with fear. We've got to recognize when God is in these moments. And of course, God is omniscient. He is omnipresent. He is always everywhere. But there are certain times, and I think you know him as well as I do, where you feel his presence more closely, where it almost is like the veil between this world and the spiritual world gets all of a sudden thin, and you can feel his presence more closely. Recognize that presence of God. The second step is responding to the presence of God. Moses did this by removing his sandals. Josh said that scholars are saying removing the sandals would demonstrate that Moses' reverent obedience to God's call. Putting off the shoe was a token of respect and submission. And so I don't know, I don't know if it's something that was commonly done in those days, but it just was this strong urge that Moses had of, man, I've got to take my sandals off. And he responded to the presence of God by taking his sandals off. So whatever is going on in your life, when you feel God's presence, respond to that in obedience. For me, it's usually falling down to my knees. Even the other day I was getting ready and I was listening to kind of a sermon and a prayer, and all of a sudden I just felt like I need to kneel down and I need to pray for a second, or at least quiet my heart and allow this prayer to just speak on behalf of me. And so that's what I did. And I just went to my room and I bent on my knees, and it was just a few moments, but it was inescapable. I had to respond to the presence of God in that way. And so you know those when that happens to you. And if you're like me, more often than not, you brush that off and you just say, I gotta finish getting ready, I'll do that later. Don't keep doing that. I'm working hard on myself not to miss the presence of God like that, and just to be obedient, even in that moment, even if it seems silly, even if I'm running late and I've got to finish getting ready, but God's calling me to do this. Respond to the presence of God. Step 3 was listen to the identity he speaks over you. In all of our lives, we've had different identities spoken over us, or we've allowed different identity to be spoken over us with social media, with the magazines we read, with the music we listen to. There is no shortage of identity messages coming our way. And yet, the only identity message we need to pay attention to is that of God, because he's our creator and he made us. He is the only one who gets a voice into our identity. And so listen to the identity that he speaks over you. He spoke ruler over Moses. And this was before Moses even set foot back in Egypt, before he ruled anyone. He called Moses according to how he saw him. And then step 2, the last step is step 4, step into the assignment God has for you. Moses did this. God equipped Moses, and Moses stepped into the assignment. that God had for him. And it was a big assignment. And Moses was totally honest in his feelings of inadequacy, of please send somebody else. God even gave Moses some signs to kind of boost his courage to say, listen, I'm with you. It's not going to be you. It's going to be me through you. You're going to be fine. But that's, I appreciate Moses for that. I feel like I could identify with him in his failings and just saying, is there anybody else you could send? Are you sure you have the right person? But really the truth is it's not us, it's God through us. So we get to step in the assignment that he has for us. But that all this identity stuff hinges on being in the presence of God and seeking his presence. And that happens when we open up his word and we read his word and we respond to his truth. So Impact Communities, I want to encourage you, spend time in his word. Maybe it's even now. What would happen if after this video you open up a book of the Bible and just read together, just round robin, each person a paragraph, like we're in the third grade again. But what a sweet thing to read scripture together and to hear scripture together and to let it wash over you. We will miss our identity. We'll always miss our identity. We'll always miss our calling before us if we never anchor our hearts and spend time in the presence of God. And that happens when we open up his word. So I just want to encourage you and leave you with that. I'm praying for your discussions. This identity is such this identity piece is always so important to come back to, so important to anchor on, and it is so important to fight for, because the world, we know it full well, the world is fighting for our identity. But God died for your identity. And so let's make sure that we respond in him. I love you guys. Take care.